Do you know the difference between carrying a rifle and carrying what it represents? The question floated across the museum gallery just as another volunteer surrendered the old Browning automatic rifle with a tired grin, rolling his shoulder while a few visitors offered polite applause. The display had become the most popular attraction of the afternoon. One after another, strong young men stepped forward to see how long they could keep the nearly 19-pound rifle shouldered. None lasted very long. Most tried to overpower it. Every one of them lost that quiet contest with gravity. The rifle returned to its padded stand once again, its walnut stock glowing beneath the warm gallery lights. Then an elderly man eased his way through the crowd with the unhurried pace of someone who had never felt the need to compete with anyone. Samuel Whitaker wore a faded canvas field jacket despite the summer weather, and leaned lightly on a smooth hickory cane, polished by decades of use. His hands trembled faintly while he rested them on the cane, enough for Ethan Brooks, the museum's young guide, to offer an encouraging smile. "Sir, there is no prize for this," Ethan said kindly. "Most people discover it is heavier than they expected." Samuel returned the smile without the slightest trace of embarrassment. His pale blue eyes settled on the old rifle instead of the crowd. They lingered on the worn walnut stock with quiet familiarity, as though he had recognized an old friend from across a busy room. "May I?" he asked. Ethan hesitated for only a second before nodding. Samuel stepped closer, but instead of reaching for the rifle immediately, he studied it. His fingertips rested lightly beneath the forend, testing its balance before lifting an ounce of weight. He adjusted his feet, almost instinctively, allowing the rifle to settle into the position it naturally wanted rather than forcing it upward. Then, with one smooth, practiced movement that seemed guided more by memory than strength, he brought it gently to his shoulder. The trembling in his hands disappeared. The rifle became perfectly still. Conversations around the gallery slowly faded until the only sound left was the soft hum of the air conditioning. And for reasons nobody could yet explain, every person in the room suddenly felt they were looking at something far more important than an old piece of steel and wood. Samuel remained motionless, allowing the rifle to find its own balance instead of forcing it into place. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His elbows settled naturally. The old sling rested against his jacket, exactly where it belonged, as though it had remembered him before he remembered it. Ethan watched with growing confusion. He had demonstrated this exhibit hundreds of times. Active duty service members had visited. College athletes had tried their luck. Weightlifters had approached with quiet confidence. Every one of them had tightened their muscles within seconds. Samuel looked as though he could have stood there until sunset. A little boy near the front of the crowd tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Why is he not shaking?" he whispered. His father searched for an answer but found none. Ethan stepped closer, careful not to interrupt whatever strange calm had settled over the gallery. "Sir," he asked with an uneasy smile, "have you handled one of these before?" Samuel's eyes remained on the walnut stock. "A long time ago," he answered. "Long enough for the years to blur together," Ethan chuckled politely. "Muscle memory?" Samuel nodded once. "Something like that." He shifted his supporting hand less than an inch. The adjustment was so small, most people missed it completely, yet the rifle seemed to become even steadier. Grace Miller noticed. From across the gallery, where she had been answering questions about another exhibit, she stopped in the middle of a sentence. She had spent more than 20 years preserving military artifacts, and experience had taught her that authentic familiarity revealed itself in details too small to imitate. Most visitors grabbed an old rifle wherever it felt comfortable. Samuel's hand had settled precisely at its natural balance point without searching for it. Ethan folded his arms. "Most people think holding it is all about strength." Samuel smiled faintly. "Strength helps for the first minute," Ethan laughed. "And after that?" Samuel finally looked at him. "After that, you stop carrying the rifle the wrong way." The answer sounded simple, but nobody quite understood it. Samuel drew a slow breath. Young shoulders usually tried to lift all 19 pounds. He gently shifted his stance, hardly moving at all. Older shoulders learned to let the weight settle into the body. Ethan frowned, studying the old man's posture more carefully. There was no strain in his neck, no tension in his jaw. It almost appeared as though the rifle had become lighter, yet common sense insisted that steel never changed its weight. Samuel quietly answered the thought no one had spoken aloud. Steel never gets lighter, he said. People simply learn where it wants to rest. His fingertips drifted across the worn walnut stalk until they stopped over a smooth patch where the finish had faded from countless years of use. He did not look surprised to find it there. Instead, his thumb brushed the old wood with the quiet familiarity of someone greeting a friend after many years apart. Grace felt an unexpected chill. That worn patch was never mentioned on the museum plaque, yet Samuel had found it without looking, and something told her that this afternoon had quietly become far more than a public demonstration. Grace found herself walking toward the display without realizing she had left her desk. The quiet gathering around Samuel had changed the atmosphere of the entire gallery. Museums usually echoed with scattered conversations, footsteps across polished floors, and children hurrying from one exhibit to the next. Now, even the youngest visitors seemed reluctant to interrupt the silence. Grace stopped a few feet away and studied the elderly man with the careful attention she normally reserved for fragile artifacts. What caught her eye was not the way he carried the rifle. It was the way he respected it. Samuel never squeezed the stock. He never shifted his grip out of discomfort. Every movement was economical, almost instinctive, as though decades had passed, but his hands had quietly refused to forget. Ethan noticed Grace watching and smiled. "Pretty remarkable, is not it?" he said. "I have never seen anyone hold it this comfortably." Grace did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on Samuel's supporting hand. The placement was exact, not approximately correct. Exact. It rested beneath the fore-end at the natural balance point, where experienced automatic riflemen had been taught to support the weapon without wasting energy. That detail was never included in the museum tour, nor was it described on the information plaque. Samuel slowly lowered the rifle, guiding its weight downward instead of letting gravity do the work. There was no sigh of relief afterward, no stretching of tired shoulders. He simply held it across both hands as though changing the position of an old toolbox he had carried 1,000 times before. Grace stepped closer. "Would you mind if I looked at something?" she asked politely. Samuel nodded and angled the rifle slightly toward her without releasing it. His fingertips paused beside a faint repair line hidden within the walnut grain. "Whoever replaced this stock did careful work," he said almost to himself. "The color matches well, but the grain runs a little straighter than the original." Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. The replacement stock had been documented during conservation nearly 30 years earlier. The repair had never been visible to visitors because it blended almost perfectly with the surrounding wood. Only the museum archives contained photographs explaining the difference. Ethan looked from Grace to Samuel. "Can you actually tell that just by looking?" Samuel smiled gently. "Looking helps." His thumb traced the smooth transition between the old receiver and the replacement wood. "Feeling tells you more." He closed his eyes for only a heartbeat, letting his fingertips rest against the stock. Walnut changes with time. Every season leaves a little of itself behind. Nobody spoke. Outside the tall windows, a warm breeze stirred the American flag standing above the museum entrance. Sunlight shifted across the gallery, casting soft reflections over the steel receiver and the polished floor beneath Samuel's boots. When he opened his eyes again, they no longer seemed focused on the exhibit itself. They had drifted somewhere much farther away. Grace recognized the expression immediately. She had seen it only a handful of times during her career, always on the faces of older veterans standing before objects that belonged as much to memory as to history. Then Samuel quietly brushed his thumb across a shallow mark near the receiver and spoke almost in a whisper. "That scratch was not there the last time this rifle came home with me." The words lingered in the gallery long after Samuel stopped speaking. Nobody rushed to answer him. The visitors simply looked from the old scratch on the walnut stalk to the quiet man standing beside it, trying to understand how someone could speak about a museum artifact as though it had once shared the same road home. Ethan forced a small smile, determined to find a practical explanation before the silence grew any heavier. "You must have studied this rifle years ago," he said. "Maybe you read an article or saw restoration photographs somewhere." Samuel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a chuckle. "Son, I have never spent much time reading about the things I already carried." The answer was gentle, never dismissive, but it settled over the room with unexpected weight. Ethan glanced toward the display plaque, hoping it might contain something that connected the old man's observations to public information. It did not. The small brass plate listed the manufacturer, the production year, the caliber, and the museum acquisition date. Nothing about replacement walnut, nothing about hidden repairs. Nothing about the shallow scratch Samuel had found without searching. Grace reached into a nearby cabinet and carefully removed a pair of white conservation gloves. She slipped them on before accepting the rifle from Samuel with both hands. Even after decades of handling historic collections, she instinctively supported the weight the way trained museum staff always did. Samuel watched quietly. "Your left hand is carrying more than it needs to," he said. Grace looked down. "Is it? Only a little." Samuel stepped beside her without touching the rifle. "Let the balance come to you first." Grace shifted her supporting hand less than an inch. The difference was immediate. The rifle seemed to settle naturally, no longer fighting against her arms. She looked up in surprise. "That is—" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. It felt different, not lighter, simply better balanced. Samuel nodded. "Old steel always tells the truth if you stop arguing with it." Ethan stared at the adjustment. It had been almost invisible, yet Grace's posture had relaxed immediately. Samuel reached out with one finger and pointed toward the upper edge of the stock. The man who fitted this replacement knew exactly what he was doing. His finger moved a little farther along the grain. He left the original sling cut untouched. Most people would have sanded it smooth. Grace slowly turned the rifle under the gallery lights. There it was, a tiny tool mark preserved beneath the finish exactly where Samuel had indicated. She had seen it before in magnified restoration photographs stored inside the museum archives, but never with the naked eye. A quiet chill ran through her. That detail had never appeared in any publication, exhibition guide, or educational program. She lowered the rifle carefully onto the padded display stand and looked at Samuel with growing disbelief. "There are only two ways someone could know these things," she said softly. Samuel met her eyes with the same calm expression he had worn since walking into the museum. "Yes," he replied. "One of them is to have been there." Grace did not answer immediately. She simply stood beside the display, looking at Samuel, as though the museum walls had quietly shifted around him. The rifle rested on its padded stand once again, but somehow it no longer felt like the center of the room. The old man did. A warm beam of afternoon sunlight drifted across the polished walnut stock, revealing tiny marks that had taken decades to appear. Samuel reached out with quiet permission in his eyes, and Grace gave a small nod. His fingertips settled lightly against the wood, not searching for imperfections but greeting familiar ones. "Walnut always tells you what kind of weather it has lived through," he said, almost to himself. "Dry summers leave one feeling. Cold winters leave another. Rain stays the longest." His thumb paused over the smooth curve of the stock. The simple touch carried him somewhere else. His breathing slowed. His eyes focused beyond the museum windows, toward a place only memory could reach. "There was one morning," he said softly, "when the clouds never lifted. Everything felt damp before the sun even came up. The canvas sling had absorbed the night's rain. My gloves were wet before I put them on. The stock felt different the moment I picked it up, only a few ounces heavier. But after enough miles, you notice things like that." Nobody interrupted him. There was nothing dramatic in his voice. He spoke the way an old carpenter might remember the feel of seasoned oak, or a rancher might describe the weight of a trusted saddle after years of use. The younger fellows used to ask when carrying it became easier. A faint smile crossed his face. "I always told them the rifle never changed." "We did." Ethan listened without taking his eyes off Samuel's hands. The old veteran was not describing a battlefield. He was describing responsibility. Every detail centered on ordinary things that only someone who had truly lived with the rifle would remember. The damp sling against a jacket. The cold walnut against worn gloves. The way steel greeted the morning before people spoke their first words. Samuel brushed away an imaginary speck of dust from the forend. "People think they remember the important days," he continued. "Truth is, after enough years, you remember ordinary mornings much better. The smell of wet canvas, coffee cooling too fast, boots that never seem completely dry. Those are the memories that stay." Grace felt an unexpected ache in her chest. Every conservation record in the archive measured dimensions, finishes, repairs, and dates. None of them preserved the feeling of lifting the rifle on a cold morning, or noticing that rain had quietly added a few ounces to the wood. Samuel rested his hand gently on the stock one last time. "That is why old rifles survive," he said. "Not because steel lasts forever. They survive because somebody cared enough to carry them properly, clean them carefully, and hand them to the next man with the hope that he would do the same." He slowly withdrew his hand, but before it left the walnut completely, his fingers paused over one smooth patch near the receiver, and his gentle smile faded into thoughtful silence. "The first man who handed this rifle to me told me to remember one thing," he whispered. "Take care of it, because one day it will be carrying someone else." Grace quietly excused herself and disappeared through the staff door leading to the museum archives. Ethan watched her go, puzzled by the urgency in her normally measured pace. Around the gallery, visitors remained where they were, speaking in hushed voices as though they had wandered into a place where ordinary conversation no longer felt appropriate. Samuel rested both hands on the smooth handle of his hickory cane and stood beside the display with patient ease. He neither expected questions nor avoided them. He simply waited. Beyond the secure door, Grace unlocked the climate-controlled records room that protected decades of military history. Long gray cabinets lined the walls, each filled with conservation reports, transfer documents, restoration photographs, handwritten letters, and acquisition files donated by veterans and their families. She knew exactly which cabinet held the rifle's history. The folder was thicker than most, its edges softened by years of careful research. She carried it to a large oak table beneath a reading lamp and slowly turned the pages. The first section contained shipping records. The second documented conservation work performed after the museum received the collection. Then she reached the original military transfer file. A faded black and white photograph slipped from between two pages. Grace carefully lifted it by the edges. Several young soldiers stood beside a muddy military truck, smiling with the quiet confidence of men who trusted one another without needing to say so. One soldier carried the same rifle resting in the gallery only a few yards away. His face was partly shaded beneath his field cap, yet the eyes were unmistakable. Calm, steady, observant. Grace looked through the office window toward Samuel. Nearly 7 decades had passed, but those eyes had not changed. She continued reading. A maintenance report described a field replacement of the walnut stock after prolonged service. Another noted a tiny conservation repair completed years later after an accidental storage blemish. Every observation Samuel had made matched the records exactly. None of those details had ever appeared on the exhibit plaque or in the public catalog. Grace turned one final divider labeled Personal Correspondence. Inside rested a letter from a retired ordnance officer who had helped transfer the collection to the museum many years earlier. One sentence had been underlined in blue ink. "If the original automatic rifleman ever visits this museum, listen before you speak." Grace read the line twice before reaching for the desk telephone. Colonel Daniel Hayes answered on the second ring. Retirement had not changed the steady confidence in his voice. "Daniel Hayes speaking." Grace chose her words carefully. "Colonel, I believe someone important is standing beside your favorite exhibit." A brief silence followed. "Who is it?" Grace glanced once more at the old photograph lying open beneath the lamp. "His name is Samuel Whitaker." The line became completely still. When the colonel finally answered, his voice carried quiet certainty rather than surprise. "I live less than 20 minutes away," he said. "Please do not let him leave. I am coming now." The museum settled into a respectful hush while everyone waited without quite knowing what they were waiting for. Samuel remained beside the display case, one hand resting lightly on his cane, the other folded over it with quiet patience. He did not glance toward the entrance. He simply admired the old rifle through the glass, as though seeing an old companion resting exactly where it belonged. Ethan stood nearby, no longer acting as a guide. Instead, he found himself watching the elderly veteran, replaying every conversation they had shared since Samuel first walked through the door. The confidence that usually carried him through every museum tour had quietly given way to curiosity, and curiosity was slowly becoming respect. A few minutes later, the front doors opened. An older gentleman in a navy sport coat entered with measured steps, carrying himself with the unmistakable posture of someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform. Colonel Daniel Hayes paused only briefly to greet Grace before she silently handed him the archival photograph. He studied it for less than a second. He did not need longer. His eyes immediately lifted toward Samuel. For several moments the colonel remained exactly where he was, saying nothing. The years between the photograph and the man standing in the gallery seemed to disappear on their own. Ethan noticed something he had never expected to see. The retired colonel instinctively straightened his shoulders before taking another step, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect had arrived before words. Samuel slowly turned, as though he had sensed the familiar presence without hearing a sound. Their eyes met across the gallery. Neither man looked surprised. They looked like two people continuing a conversation that had simply been interrupted by time. The colonel approached until only a few feet separated them. "Mr. Whitaker," he said quietly, "I have hoped for many years that our paths would cross." Samuel smiled with gentle warmth. "Then today has been kind to both of us." The colonel nodded and carefully removed the old photograph from its protective sleeve. He held it beside Samuel's face. The resemblance was unmistakable. Time had whitened his hair, softened the lines of youth, and placed decades upon his shoulders. But the calm eyes in the photograph were exactly the same eyes looking back at them now. "My father served in that unit," the colonel said. He rarely spoke about himself. But whenever someone asked who taught him what steady leadership looked like, he always mentioned one name. Ethan listened without moving. "Samuel Whitaker." The colonel's voice remained calm, almost conversational. He said, "You never asked anyone to carry more than you were willing to carry yourself." Samuel lowered his eyes for a moment and smiled quietly. "Your father gave that rifle back to me cleaner than I handed it to him. That told me everything I needed to know about the man he became." The colonel's expression softened. Around them, every conversation in the gallery had faded into complete silence once again. Visitors no longer felt as though they were observing a museum exhibit. They felt as though history itself had stepped away from the display case and quietly introduced itself by name. Colonel Hayes reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and carefully unfolded a weathered photograph whose edges had softened with age. He held it beside the display case, allowing the visitors closest to him to see it without taking it from his hands. The picture showed a line of young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a gray sky, their uniforms worn from long weeks outdoors. Near the center stood a young man with the same calm eyes and the same quiet posture as the elderly visitor now standing beside the museum exhibit. Nobody needed to ask who it was. The years had changed Samuel Whitaker's face, but they had never changed the way he carried himself. Colonel Hayes slipped the photograph back into its protective sleeve and looked at Samuel with unmistakable gratitude. "My father kept this picture in his desk until the day he retired," he said. Whenever someone complimented his leadership, he would smile and say he learned the most important lessons from the man carrying that rifle. Samuel lowered his eyes with quiet humility. "Your father learned those lessons because he was willing to listen," he replied. "That was always his greatest strength." For a long moment neither man spoke. The museum seemed to breathe more slowly around them. Then, without ceremony or announcement, Colonel Hayes removed his cap and tucked it beneath one arm. His shoulders, straightened with practiced ease, came calmly to attention and offered Samuel a slow, deliberate salute. There was nothing theatrical about the gesture. It was simple, measured, and deeply sincere. Samuel looked almost uncomfortable receiving such respect. After a brief pause, he returned the salute with the same quiet dignity, his movements smooth despite the years resting upon him. No one applauded. No one reached for a camera. A retired Air Force pilot standing near the entrance quietly removed his own cap. Across the gallery, an elderly Navy veteran did the same before placing one hand gently over his heart. A former Army nurse standing beside her grandson simply lowered her head with a grateful smile. The younger visitors watched without fully understanding every detail, yet they instinctively sensed they were witnessing something that deserved silence rather than celebration. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Only an hour earlier he had seen Samuel as an ordinary elderly visitor, hoping to try a museum exhibit. Now he understood that true character rarely announced itself. It revealed itself patiently, one quiet moment at a time. Colonel Hayes slowly lowered his hand. For years, he said, glancing toward the old rifle behind the glass, we believed we were preserving an important artifact. He turned back toward Samuel. Today you reminded us that the real treasure was never the steel or the walnut. It was the example carried beside it. Samuel smiled gently, his eyes moving once more toward the old rifle. Objects help people remember, he said, but it is people who give objects something worth remembering. Grace carefully unlocked the display case one final time and lifted the old rifle with both hands. She did not carry it as a curator presenting an exhibit anymore. She carried it the way someone carries a family keepsake entrusted across generations. Without a word, she offered it to Samuel. He accepted it gently, letting the familiar weight settle naturally before bringing it once more against his shoulder. There was no strain, no performance, only quiet familiarity. For a brief moment the years seemed to disappear, not because the old man had become young again, but because experience had quietly overcome age. Samuel closed his eyes and drew a slow breath that carried the faint scent of old walnut and well-oiled steel. A warm smile appeared. Ethan could not help asking the question that had stayed with him all afternoon. "Does it feel lighter now?" Samuel opened his eyes and looked at the young guide with patient kindness. He slowly shook his head. "No, son." His fingers rested lightly against the smooth stock. "It weighs exactly what it always did." He glanced around the gallery, taking in the veterans, the families, the children, and the museum staff who had gathered without realizing they had become part of the story themselves. "The difference is that I no longer carry the memories by myself." The words settled over the room more gently than applause ever could. Grace carefully guided the rifle back onto its padded mounts, while Samuel made one small adjustment to the sling so it rested naturally against the stock. Colonel Hayes noticed immediately and smiled. "You still remember exactly how it belongs." Samuel nodded. "Some lessons stay in your hands longer than they stay in your mind." Ethan stepped forward, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet humility. "Mr. Whitaker, I judged you before I knew anything about you." Samuel rested a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "That happens to all of us. We see the steel before we see the story." Ethan lowered his eyes, knowing he would remember those words for the rest of his life. Outside, the late afternoon sun spread long bands of golden light across the museum entrance. Samuel picked up his hickory cane, adjusted his faded canvas jacket, and thanked Grace and the colonel with a simple nod. Colonel Hayes offered to walk him to his car, but Samuel smiled warmly. "I have been finding my own way home for a long time." He stepped through the front doors and disappeared into the quiet summer afternoon like any ordinary visitor. No cameras followed him. No crowd gathered around him. The museum doors closed softly behind him, leaving only the old rifle resting beneath the lights. Ethan remained standing before the display case long after everyone else had drifted away. The information plaque still listed the rifle's weight as nearly 19 pounds. He smiled to himself, realizing that the museum had measured every ounce of steel with perfect accuracy. It was everything the rifle had quietly carried through the years that could never be measured, and perhaps that was the part most worth remembering.